Hi, everybody. Today's November 9th, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me author of The Big Fail, Joe Nocera. Joe, tell us about yourself and how you came to that book and the title.
Well, the title's easy to explain. COVID was a massive, our response to COVID was a massive fuck up. And the big fail was a polite way to say that. So uh, my co-author, Bethany McLean, and I co-authored a book after the financial crisis called All the Devils Are Here, which really tried to explain the roots of the problems that led to the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
With collateralized debt obligations and so on and so forth, and the way Wall Street went crazy. And so we went our separate ways, more or less, although we're very close friends. And when COVID struck, we decided that the issue was important enough. We were both passionate about wanting to write about it, and that we were a good team, and we should give it a go. So that's what we did.
When did you start in on that, and when did you kind of sour on the? I assume you did sour on the lockdown concept.
Well, let's see. We probably started on it by the summer of 2020, I would say. And, the first thing that comes to mind is that I had a son in fourth grade at the time in public school, in New York City public school. And remote learning was a complete disaster. His teacher had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old at home with her, and she's trying to teach 25 kids. It was insane. Eventually, they'd see her for 15 minutes a day, and she'd just give them homework assignments. So we moved my kid to private school for fifth grade, but all the while, I kept my eye out for what was going on. So the first thing I came to was this: closing the schools is terrible. What's going on here? And that kind of led us to really think hard about lockdowns and start to look at the studies around lockdowns, and also the inequities around lockdowns and the economic consequences of lockdowns. And then I stumbled across D.A. Henderson, who we'll talk about shortly, and realized that this great epidemiologist from the 20th century, perhaps the greatest epidemiologist of the 20th century, was adamant before he died that locking up society was a mistake that would cause panic and wouldn't save that many lives.
I agree.
I kind of thought you would.
Yeah. It seems to me, I bring this dream up a few times. I had this dream 30 years ago, and it was so vivid. I'm struggling like Sisyphusianly against a big block of ice. I'm like a lion tamer with a whip, and for some reason I won't have this ice melt, and it's sweltering. It's like 90, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and my job, I'm tasked with keeping this ice from melting. And there's no way you can whip ice into not melting. It's a hot day, but somehow I'm convinced that this will work. And I've come upon this the thought of this dream so many times. It's maybe it's a good idea to try to convince ice not to melt, but it just seems so absurd at the face right from the get go. And ditto, trying to convince a virus not to transmit because of what? I don't know, because you are having people sit at home or something like that. People still communicate. People, viruses do viruses, and not only that, but they mutate. And it just seems to me that this was a kind of an own goal, a terrible mistake. But you were in the context of New York City, which seems in some ways be the epicenter, not just of ground zero, 2001, but of this as well. I mean, I think there was a lot of lead up through the New York Times. I don't know if you're familiar with Donald McNeil and his.
Yeah, I know Don actually.
Did your opinion of the threat of the virus change? Had you been listening to his work, Go Medieval on the Virus, that kind of stuff, and his podcast efforts in February 2020 that led up to kind of the New
Well,
York.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to tell you the answer to that question is no. I was not doing that. I came to this all by my lonesome with Bethany, who's very data oriented, and um, also it offended me that we in the upper middle class were sitting in our comfortable apartments, and all these people who didn't have any money were working for DoorDash and delivering us food, or in a meat packing plant or in an Amazon warehouse. And it was like, you know, don't their lives matter too? I mean, if you really care, if you really think lockdowns are going to save people's lives, is it your view that the upper middle class lives should be saved, but the lower class lives are expendable? What's up with that? So that bugged the shit out of me. But then the other thing is, I will say this. Look, for people who are 65 and over, there is something to be said for having them, stay out of harm's way until there's a vaccine. Now, I don't know where you are on vaccines, and if you're anti-vaccine, I hope we don't go there.
Well,
but my point is, you can't shut down an entire. This was an unusual virus in that it killed the elderly, but it left kids alone. And the younger you were, the less likely you were to be deadly sick from COVID.
Absolutely.
So this is what Martin Kulldorff was saying. This is what Jay Bhattacharya was saying. Yeah. And Sunetra Gupta.
Sunetra Gupta. We don't want to forget about her.
Yes, we don't want to forget about her. And that's what the Great Barrington Declaration says. It's like, protect the immunocompromised, protect the elderly, wait for a virus for those people, and for everybody else, look, if you want to stay at home, stay at home. But
right,
we're going to keep society going.
Right. Yeah. Now it's not about this podcast, not about me, but I'll just get this out of the way. I've given out thousands of vaccines. I'm a medical doctor. I had my own practice for about 27 years, and I've worked elsewhere. And I've taken dozens of vaccines myself. I took the flu shot every single year. And I think that, I made a kind of an equation in my head that the flu shot was a useful thing, kept me working through the winters. I don't think they're perfect. I kind of had an 80% rule. I think they work on 80% of the strains, predictably. They kind of take away 80% of your symptoms, and anyway, blah, blah, blah. And so I found that they were very helpful, keeping me less sick. The times I didn't take it, I had horrible flu, blah, blah, blah. I personally don't think coronavirus is unique. I think it's kind of an influenza level event. It just so happens we didn't have a vaccine prior, as we've had for the flu since the 1950s, 60s, whatever. So, for a naive population, coronavirus is similar to the influenza to a naive population, except we don't have naive populations to the flu. As far as pro-vax, anti-vax, the example I came up with is clothing. If you wear a parka, if it's that same 90 degree sweltering day, and you go to the beach wearing everything you own, a parka, a hat, galoshes, winter, so forth, you're wearing too much clothing. If you go to the beach with the right amount of clothing and somebody yells at you, you're anti-clothing, you're not wearing everything. Well, that's absurd. So I'm not anti-clothing. I wear the right amount of clothing for the right situation. There's the right vaccine for the right situation. Kids didn't get sick from this. You make a good point. I don't think it's any way unique having kids get less sick from respiratory illnesses. That's pretty much across the board. They might sniffle more and this and that, but they don't drop dead from the flu either. And so this was known information from the Diamond Princess. Did you kind of incorporate the Diamond Princess in any of your peregrinations mentally at the time or thereafter?
We told the story of it and what it foretold, and we also talked about how nuts the government became obsessed with getting the Diamond Princess people home, back to the U.S., instead of thinking more broadly about how do we mitigate this virus before it becomes unstoppable. Now, maybe it would have been unstoppable anyway, but basically the entire White House just spent, every second trying to figure out how to get the Diamond Princess people home. And that's kind of where our focus was for that story.
But what about the data from the Diamond Princess? I mean, the actual, fatality, mortality rate versus what China had promulgated.
Right. Well, My sense. Look, I think I'm sure there was data about the Diamond Princess. We didn't really focus on that. We focused a little bit more on Italy and what the data coming out of Italy was, because that affected. I know it affected DeSantis's thinking in Florida, and I think it affected a lot of public health people in general.
Okay.
But if you want to tell me what the Diamond Princess data was, I'd love to hear it.
Well, we don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I mean, it's been written. There were 3,711 people on the board, on the boat. And overall, the mortality rate was an order of magnitude less than what was presented that from China. Frankly, less than that even. By the time that Fauci was, I have an article in Brownstone, Dr. Fauci's own gain of function, and a follow-up about EcoHealth Alliance. Dr. Fauci was aware of this, and my Google fingers show me that he was talking about it here and there. And he was watching it and aware of it, and yet somehow made this into a huge mega problem, almost on the level of a Chinese bioweapon, whatever. I'm not sure what chit chat was going on in upper levels, but Fauci was aware of this, and he should easily have known about the lack of mortality. By the time they were making their decisions in February and then March, out of that 3,711 people on board, by February, like none of them had died, and by March, like 4 or so had died. By June, 10 had died. Now the ultimate number 10 is probably inflated by 2, because the people who died were median age 82. It's a cruise ship, old people and so forth, and they might have died from unrelated reasons by the time a few months had passed. So on an acute basis, they had touched landfall, whatever, in China, mainland China, on this boat in January 25th or so. So using the regular incubation period of a few weeks, by the time, if you're going to get sick and die from this, it should have been by mid-February that would have happened. Nobody had died by that point. So there were a few deaths thereafter, probably, somewhere between 0 and a handful of people died on that boat. And again, median age 82. The people who were young, there were, far fewer demographically young people on a boat like that. It's expensive and whatnot. But I think there were 300 kids on the boat. None of them even knew they had anything. So there's no illness. Nobody had symptoms, nothing. And the staff are in their 20s and whatnot, same pretty much thing. And so nobody under 55 had any documented illness. And they were all, they did this COVID testing, and they found, people having this. But again, the illness was really nothing except for the elderly. That was the time.
Case made.
But, my enduring curiosity is what, the purpose of my article recently in Brownstone is what made Dr. Fauci switch from the open, obvious data that was, reproducible or observable and not based in potentially Chinese propaganda layers. And why did he go with that instead of China's own, lockdown policies?
I agree with you. It seems inexplicable. I don't understand why he. From my point of view, there was no science to support lockdowns, and China, it had never been done before on a citywide basis or countrywide basis before China did it. And in 2019, Jennifer Nuzzo, who's now at Brown University, the epidemiologist, had written a study, or had been the head of a large, complex study that said, we've got all these mitigation measures, but we really don't know if they work or not. And we really shouldn't be quick to employ them until we know if they work. And instead, they embraced lockdowns as if they were, a tried and true technique for fighting a virus. And that's the part that really perplexed me about Fauci, is that for somebody who'd been involved in AIDS and H1N1 and Ebola and all sorts of diseases, you would think he would know better.
You mentioned Professor Henderson earlier. What was the work of his that you looked at? A, B. Have you looked at the etymology of the word lockdown? Hint, it's from prisons. And C, what was the genesis of the lockdown movement that I guess his 2006 article was supposed to counter within the Bush administration?
Right. So you've asked a lot of questions there.
Yeah.
from my point of view, the etymology, yes, lockdown has always been a phrase used for prisoners. You know, you lock them down, they have a riot, so you have to lock down the prisoner, and the prisoners have to stay in their cells and they can't get out, which, by the way, is pretty much what China did. I can't remember the word, but, you know, Peter Hessler in the New Yorker used a Chinese word. It said the word they used in China was sealed city, and the translation in the English language quickly adopted the word lockdown instead of sealed city. So that's as much as I know about the etymology. D.A. Henderson. So I actually, you know, were you at AIER before you went to Brownstone?
No, I just migrated to Brownstone from Panda. I'm just kind of a solo doctor, and I started working on the Zika pandemic as an author in 2019 or so. And so I was on pandemics before this pandemic, oddly enough, and it pretty much has eclipsed my work, which would have been otherwise very, you know, even more interesting. It's very interesting, but it kind of like took everyone's pandemic piece of their brain away from looking at the failure of the Zika, the disappearance of Zika microcephaly. Anyway, that's a side story. So I had written on this, and then I you know, started working with some of the groups that were against lockdowns, and then migrated to Brownstone.
So I discovered D.A. Henderson on the website of AIER, American.
Right, I read that article.
Institute for Economic Research, I think it's called, and they're in Great Barrington. Right. And then I started to research D.A. Henderson. Who is this guy? And it turns out, you know, when he was in his 30s, he was loaned out by the CDC to the WHO and put in charge of a project that nobody thought could succeed, which was to eliminate smallpox. Mm-hmm. And he did it with obviously a large team and not much help, but he was the leader of the group that eliminated smallpox as a disease in the world, not just one country, the world. So then he becomes the dean of the Johns Hopkins Public Health School. And then he goes in and is in and out of government, you know, all through his 60s and 70s. He starts a biodefense, little think tank to fight bioweapons. He's worried about that. And so when the Bush administration started to think about a pandemic plan, it was natural that they made him part of it. Mm-hmm. Or brought him in and talked to him about ideas. But they thought he was an old fuddy-duddy. If you read Michael Lewis's book about the pandemic, The Premonition, mm-hmm. you'll see mm-hmm. Michael scoff at him and kind of dismiss him as somebody who's over the hill, because that's how they thought of him inside the White House. But he wasn't. And his essential thesis, so as they're getting towards the end of putting together this mitigation plan, he and Jennifer Nuzzo and two other epidemiologists write a paper, and they basically say, most of what you're thinking about doing is a mistake. Mm-hmm. You could shut down air traffic if you want, but it's been shown time and again that it doesn't work. You can, and then he went on about the importance of understanding human behavior. I mean, people went to work during the Black Death. You know, it's like human behavior is something you have to take into account. And so he ends the piece by saying, pull up that paragraph again. He ends the piece by saying, the most important thing is right. Experience has shown that communities faced with epidemics respond best and with the least anxiety when the normal social functioning of the community is least disrupted. Strong political and public health leadership to provide reassurance and to ensure the needed medical care services are provided are critical elements. And then this is a really key sentence. If either is seen to be less than optimal, a manageable epidemic could move towards catastrophe. So we didn't have strong political and public health leadership, right? And we did panic as a society, and we really did, with rare exception, shut down the normal social function of the community. So yeah, we got a catastrophe, as D.A. Henderson predicted we would. I know you have a third question in there, but I forgot
Absolutely
what.
right. Well, I think we're good with that. What was how did this kind of stay as a theme? Do we know how this stayed as a theme within kind of the executive and or public health realm, lockdowns?
Well, it's a little hard to. So first of all, it became politicized. So the blue states embraced lockdowns and social distancing and masking and shutting down restaurants and so on and so forth. The red states, led by DeSantis in Florida, took the position that this is all nonsense and we shouldn't have to do any of this stuff. And now I'm slightly exaggerating. I mean, DeSantis got really mad at one point when there was an upsurge in COVID, and he blamed it on all the young kids who were flooding in the bars. So he shut the bars down for a while. But basically, what would happen is like take Los Angeles is a really good example of this. They'd lock down. The incidence of cases would decline. They would start to open up again. Restaurants would go to 25% or 50%. They didn't open schools, but people were allowed out again. So on and so forth. And then once that happened, there would be an upsurge, and so they would start to lock down again. And they just do this back and forth. It drove business people crazy in Los Angeles. And it's a lot of the reason why Gavin Newsom, they'd had the recall petition, because there were so many angry small business people who felt they were being jerked around by the state. But so from their way of thinking, well, you see, the reason the virus had an upsurge is because we let people out of their homes. But the other way to look at it is the virus was always there. It didn't go away. You could keep them, unless you wanted to lock them up until you until you had a virus, until you had a vaccine. It was going to happen. That's exactly what was going to happen. It was inevitable because
it was always an absurdity.
Right. What they didn't understand was the virus doesn't go away when you lock people up.
I think people in public health should know this. This is not a complicated thing. A respiratory virus, pretty much exists as long as humans and every other animal on Earth has existed. My dog sneezes. I don't really keep track of raccoons and elephants, but I assume they sneeze as well. Respiratory viruses are part of the deal. Mosquitoes. There's a lot of things out there that kind of feed on us and whatnot, and we feed on other things. This is the circle of life. And so viruses are not clever, but on a population basis, there's so many of them that they can basically morph enough to be opportunistic and feed on bits of us such as they can as vehicles. Basically, they carjack us into making replicas of themselves. Fine, that's what viruses do. That is part and parcel of living. There's symbiosis and whatnot. I mean, I don't know if any viruses are actually good or not, but it's part of life. And this concept of basically they inverted the concept of cases. If you have, I'm a medical doctor, and if somebody comes and has a case of pneumonia, they are actually sick with it. You can theoretically have latent. If we do tuberculosis tests, we might find people who are history of tuberculosis. They're latent. They've been exposed to it, but they're not sick. We don't call them a case of tuberculosis. We say they're positive PPD test. There was a kind of a transmogrification or a confusion, a confounding of the term case. So it became, if they tested you and you showed up positive in this COVID test, they called you a case of COVID. This is idiotic. A case of something is not the fact that you have been exposed to something. And I think they also kind of forgot, conveniently or not, that coronaviruses have always been around. Aside from SARS, we think of coronavirus as this big, evil, horrible thing. very, 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 very bad, virus. But coronaviruses are the second most commonly named cause of the common cold. The first is the most common one is unknown, but amongst the named ones, I think there's rhinovirus, and then or maybe adenovirus, one of those two, and then coronavirus. And so what? And there seems to be a lot of bleed between people who happen to have a coronavirus common cold and SARS-CoV-2. There's not perfect specificity that documents these SARS cases. How do I know that? Because Omicron is probably not even a descendant of SARS-CoV-2, and people show positive for that. They call themselves having COVID-19. So it's an absurdity. But the public health people should have known this. So I just, I'm not a conspiracy guy, but I am a skeptic. And it doesn't make sense. I mean, I think Fauci was a smart guy. I think he graduated summa cum laude from Holy Cross or something like that. So he's a smart guy, ostensibly, and he should have known better. And so when people don't act according to how they should have known and be forthright about it, I think there's something else going on. And I think it was
okay. So hold on. So I don't believe this, but I want to ask you this, okay?
Sure.
We had an excerpt, Bethany and I, of the lockdown material from the book in New York Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And it got a lot of
heat.
It got a lot of heat, both ways. But the people on the far right all said, "You're wrong about this, Joe. It wasn't just them being stupid. It was a plot to control the American public, to show how much to make us all guinea pigs, and to put us in our homes to show how we could how the elites could take control of the common person." Now, to me, that's insane. But what do you think?
Well, give me a specific question. What do I think about that? First of all, I always hate far right because I think nobody on the left gets termed far left. I think it's always
wait. No, they don't use far left, but they use progressive, which is just as bad.
Well, no, it's not just as bad. But I also don't like the term anti-vax because a lot of people get called anti-vax. But again, I think it's like the clothing analogy. If you just have the right amount, doesn't mean you're anti-vax. If I don't think a 9-year-old should get this thing, I'm not anti-vax. But I've been called that. I've actually been assaulted, literally.
And the reason you don't think a 9-year-old should get it is what?
Well, because 9-year-olds don't get sick from this. And until you have a good health and safety profile, there's no sense guinea pigging, if that's a verb, your children. Clearly they don't have an issue with this virus. The Diamond Princess knew this, back in February. The data was there, obviously, that kids and kids, the actual, I brought a prop with me, the actual number of children who don't have other morbid illnesses, cancer and whatnot, morbid obesity and so forth, the number of juveniles who dropped dead easily in Israel, actually, I think the people under age 49 without comorbidities in Israel who died from COVID is literally this. And the number of people in the United States under age 10 or so who died, we have a larger population. There's only 10 million people in Israel, give or take. And we have a population over 300 million. The number of children in the United States without comorbidities, without severe illness, cancer, chemotherapy, blah, 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 is literally also zero. So I brought that prop with me there. So there's no risk.
Because I was talking not that long ago to Michael Osterholm, and he was basically saying that in 2021 and 2022, each year, some 12 to 1,500 kids died of COVID, and you would say that most of those had comorbidities.
Well, when you dig a little bit, kids do get sick. We have children's hospitals, okay? So children's hospitals, I assume they're there because children do get sick. So they do get sick, they do get illness. They don't get sick and ill as often as adults. But when they do, they can have, a severe one. My parents' first child, had a cancer at age 3.5 and passed. So I don't know what kind of chemotherapy they had back then. But you have that, you have an immune change and so forth. But regular kids running around the playground, all that kind of stuff, normal physique and whatnot, body type, do not get sick and they do not die from COVID. And kids do die from other things, mind you. So if you want to do a kind of relative risk factor, you would also tell kids, if you want to give the kids a vaccine for this, you should tell kids not to go on the pretty much any playground apparatus, because those risks are far higher. They should never swim. They shouldn't ski. They shouldn't play football. They shouldn't do this because deaths occur. There are kids who die. I mean, we saw somebody die pretty much on the football field as an adult last year or year and a half, whatever it was. And so deaths happen. So this is part of life, is death. But but a risk benefit analysis for this vaccine is impossible to determine until you have a reasonable pathway of exposure. So a normal vaccine takes 5 to 7 years to get into existence. I mean, my topic.
So I would argue what you just said, that one of the greatest failures of the public health establishment was not explaining to people what the risk factor was.
Yeah, exactly.
And instead, they didn't make any distinction between somebody who is 80 Absolutely. And somebody who is 5.
Absolutely. They also.
I think that was really criminal because that gave the teachers union, for instance,
yes,
the ammunition.
You're absolutely right about
that they needed to keep the schools closed.
The default position, getting back to my dog, his default position is lying down and being warm. And it takes me real effort. Now I almost have to be a psychotherapist to get him off the bed. Come on, it's time to get up. I got to cajole him. And I think the default position of all of us, we'd rather just kind of sit around and I don't know, hang out. And if you have a union who's, maybe default position is pay us, we'll stay at home. Yeah, they're going to want that. And yes, there was no stratification of risk. I did this early on. I'm no, great epidemiologist. I'm a primary care doctor, but it wasn't that hard to see the stratification of risk. It's literally, I brought my other prop with me, is 5 orders of magnitude higher between, say, your 80-year-old, 85-year-old in a nursing home and your 8-year-old, more, till 10,000, even 100,000 times higher risk for a nursing home. And mind you, people in nursing homes don't live forever. If you're in a nursing home and your nursing home quality or lack of quality of life, your life expectancy is about 13 months. So the turnover in a nursing home is 50% per year. And so be it. I mean, that is, again, death, life. You can't have one without the other pretty much.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
There's another aspect of the vaccine that's worth mentioning that we mentioned in our book, and I haven't seen anybody else talk about this.
Okay.
All that vaccine that was wasted on kids would have been so much better used in Africa or poor countries in Asia that didn't have any vaccines.
Yeah,
and they were giving people booster shots that they don't need.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes on and on and on. I agree. I think there are a few disjoints. I would take your excellent idea and mutate it, because we're talking about viruses, mutate it slightly to say that we just should have taken that money and put it for malaria, HIV, and tuberculosis. Africa didn't need this. Okay, they have I have separately a book in galleys on cancer, and I came up with a phrase. I've looked to see if anybody else has this phrase, and I haven't seen it. So I'm going to call myself the originator of it. But I call cancer a disease of success, and nobody likes it. If you have cancer, it's miserable. I was mentioning my late brother. It's miserable. That's not not a success. But for the most part, if your society is worrying about cancer, that means it is not dying from famine, war, pestilence, etc. And so the ancient Egyptians, they had maybe their issues, but they didn't really have cancer. The Romans, didn't have cancer. They don't talk about it that much. It's a success to live long enough to get cancer as your major problem. Africa doesn't really have a cancer problem. You can go to Sudan and they don't really have cancer wards and so forth because people are not living long enough to really have that. I mean, some of the elites, yes. In the Congo, it's not really an issue. So their problem is not having COVID vaccines. They have more of an outdoor society. Most of Africa is warm, we'll call it, and a lot of it's tropical. And they have kind of an open air outdoor society, and they don't have respiratory illnesses the same way we do. Because things are more open. There's a lot more breeze going by. And not only that, but they got bigger problems. And their biggest problem, the biggest threat to them was frankly the diminishment of trade and the kind of slightly ramping up towards getting out of the third world, or poverty into something else. I mean, the biggest determinant of public health over the course of mankind is not, pills, is not injections. It's public health measures brought about by greater prosperity. And prosperity comes from trade, and we stop the world. This is an absurdity. Again, getting back to my lion tamer holding the ice back, it was crazy stuff. And these countries will suffer, probably for a generation because of the diminishment in expectations of their growth. So places like Ghana and whatnot, they were kind of working their way out economically, and that's how societies get better.
Okay,
They
now Randall.
didn't really have COVID fatalities the same way we did. In a lot of places like Tanzania, their president decided, I'm not saying he had a great knowledge base, but he decided that the COVID stuff was the work of the devil. I'm sort of quoting on this, but you can look it up. And he's like, we're not having any of this. We're not doing this. We're not doing this. We have bigger problems. And so he wasn't right about the devil part, but I think he was right about the bigger problems part. And I would take all the COVID vaccine stuff and just work it into something else. I mean, I think there's a big, kind of regulatory capture question between big pharma and big public health. You don't have to use the word big there, but between pharma and public health that has made vaccines the modality of our public health measures. And public health is actually literally supported in large part by grants from pharma. And this is a big aspect, an unspoken aspect.
Aren't you supposed to be interviewing me?
I'm sorry about that. I apologize.
All right, so I'm going to say one other thing, and then we're probably done. I am more liberal than not. Bethany's more of a centrist. Neither one of us would qualify as conservatives. And yet, we came to these conclusions that are very much aligned with conservatives. And the reason we did that is because we focused on data.
Yep.
And we didn't focus on political, memes or positions or, follow the science or on the other side, vaccines will kill you. And I think that one of the failings in COVID and maybe in the larger society is that people really aren't willing to look at data. They just want to know what their team says.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Whatever their team says is what they're going to say.
You have what is your hat? It's not a Yankees hat, is it?
No, Barry Weiss, the Free Press.
Because
let's give her a plug.
Okay, absolutely. I love her. I've not met her. So my brothers. I grew up in New York City in the Bronx, and my two brothers are Yankees fan, and both of them have put their kids in Yankees stuff from age 0 on, and they love and follow the Yankees. I'm kind of agnostic about this. I moved to Boston ages ago, 40 years ago, and my kids grew up with Boston teams. They don't care that much either. But I've had a lot of animosity because I'm not like religiously a Yankees fan, and I like the Yankees. I have nothing against them. Don't get me wrong, but when they're playing the Red Sox, I kind of have my own personal barometer. It's I think I'm rooting for the Red Sox now. I've been here for ages. I go to the Red Sox.
I hate the Yankees. I grew up in Rhode Island. I've rooted for the Red Sox my entire life. Also the Celtics, also the Bruins, also the Patriots.
Well, there you go. But the thing is, if you
Providence College, let's get this in, and the Providence College Friars, folks.
There you go. But if you wear this hat, then it's like you have to only, love Yankees. And I asked my older brother once, and he was a journalist, and I forget which trade it was. I mean, that we've had Red Sox go to the Yankees and vice versa. And Johnny Damon, I think it was, he hated Johnny Damon. Then he becomes a Yankee. Now he loves Johnny Damon. It's like, what happened to Johnny Damon? Like nothing. He's the same guy, maybe a year older, but you either love him or hate him. It's like, I don't know. It's just kind of a funny thing. I mean, I like team sports and I root for teams and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of it is exactly as you say, it's a team sport, and people kind of figure out how they have to shade these things one way or another. And I'm very much appreciative that you used a data approach. And I don't know if you ever saw the study along the way. It had what do Republicans and or Democrats think is the relative risk of getting COVID and dying? And again, order of magnitude almost higher. The Democrats thought COVID was an evil, bad monster and was going to kill them. And the Republicans actually thought less, and they were correct. And this kind of was across the board. So they had more rational approach. And again, I don't like these terms, anti-vax, anti-this and this, but it's really a matter of measuring. But Dr. Fauci himself knew, he said in my Fauci article, I did a lot of Fauci stuff. He said that the risk from COVID-19 is minuscule in February 2020. This is with the Diamond Princess somewhere in his cranium. He said the risk is minuscule. Then what happened? So I think, there's some smoking gun there, and I've got my own theory about that. But again, I'm interviewing you. So let's talk about the big fail
It's 11:01, so we got to wrap it up pretty soon, Randall.
Absolutely. So I'm going to do something that's kind of counterintuitive. I'm going to shut up and let you.
I'll believe it. I believe it when I see it, Randall.
All right. So tell us about what your reception's been, why you want people to read this book, what we can learn from it, and what are the lessons going forward.
The reception has been really good, nice, flattering, everything. We've gotten, although it hasn't been reviewed yet in the mainstream New York Times, Washington Post, etc. The reviews that we have gotten have been spectacular, and people who have read it, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, may disagree with this or that, but they have been very, they have praised the book and even told us that it had changed some of how they thought about the pandemic and what happened during the pandemic. So that's been really good. Where do we go from here? Well, if we lived in a less polarized society, I would argue for us to have a commission like we had after the financial crisis to kind of get to the bottom of what happened, and in this case, to get to the bottom of what worked and what didn't. The only Congress, the Republicans had a committee that was supposed to do that, but all they really cared about was whether the virus emanated from the lab in Wuhan, and they didn't really care about anything else. So I would argue that would be a useful thing, and then we could start to talk about, how should a society act when this happens again? What do we do? How do we not panic? How do we have measures? The pandemic plans that Bush did and that Obama then followed up on, they were worthless. All they were was suggestions on a piece of paper. There was no money behind it. There was no effort to put anything in force. There was no way nobody went down to the state and county level and talked to public health about what they should do. Nothing. So, to do it right, you have to think hard about this, and you have to put aside politics. That's kind of all I got to say.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there, and I applaud you for using the lens of actual data. Again, I think that it's a tricky world out there. There's definition of a conservative as a liberal mugged, and I've seen this a lot in the COVID world. That just the ironies of having kind of a card, an ID card to let you into restaurants. All the people, they go right from the drama of BLM, Black Lives Matter, to having blacks who had a far lower vaccine acceptance rate not being allowed into restaurants, essentially, for different reasons, but with an ID card, kind of like not quite Jim Crow, but Jim Coronavirus, and just a crazy.
Well, to me, the most telling anecdote in our book along those lines of somebody who, sort of changed their views was this Bethany. There was some woman, some psychiatrist that Bethany interviewed who dealt with autistic kids. And she said at the beginning, she totally bought into everything the public health establishment was saying, lockdowns and social distancing and, shutting down the schools. But then gradually she realized that these autistic kids were being left to fend for themselves. And all their entire support system was gone. And she said it was just horrific to see what was happening to them. And it made her realize that however bad coronavirus was, abandoning these autistic kids was much, much, much worse. So she changed, she came around. And she wound up signing the Great Barrington Declaration.
Oh, lovely. I like that. My father was a lawyer and my brother's a lawyer. But there's a joke, how do you keep a lawyer from drowning?
I don't know.
You take your foot off his neck. But anyway, so what we've done basically is we allowed society to live. All the people take credit for the jobs, that return and all that. All we did was take our foot off the society's neck. And I've tried to work out a word for like social suicide. It's like socio-science, society socio-suicide, whatever, socio-suicide or something. And that's kind of what we did. We did this, nationwide or worldwide hara-kiri, and purposelessly. Again, it wasn't a big bad thing. I get it. If it had been the zombie apocalypse, or aerosolized anthrax or something like that, yeah, fine. I don't know, space rays, but this wasn't it. This wasn't it, and it was obvious from the Diamond Princess right from the get-go. It wasn't, and everything else kind of became a malfeasance, a storm. And I think there was a political aspect to it. I think I'll give you one quick anecdote myself. I call him a friend, but we're not as friendly as we used to be. It's kind of like the before times, the after times. And he's a pediatrician, medical doctor, and he's reasonably prominent. And I saw him locally, and he had gotten COVID early on in, like, I don't know, March or April 2020, because he sees a lot of kids and whatnot. So he had it. And I'm like, how bad was it? He said, kind of bad cold, sniffles, blah, blah, blah. He's in good health, an athlete, all that kind of stuff. And then his wife wound up getting it. How's she? Oh, fine, same. It's no, we're kind of laid up for a day or two, blah, blah, blah. Kind of a flu, cold thing, somewhere in that realm. And they're both about in their 50s. And I was like, oh, wow. So can you stop wearing a mask now? Are you going to still wear a mask at work? It's like, yeah. Like, well, why? Do you think you can get it again? He says, no. Do you think you could give it to anybody else? No. Do you think it would be useful for kids to see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel? Yep. So why won't you wear a mask? He says, well, it's not really the right time yet. I'm like, well, who's going to determine the right time? Anyway, long story short is that Nancy Pelosi, for him, would determine the right time. He says there's still a lot of political maneuvering around. We have to get rid of Trump. And this became the mail-in ballots and all kinds of stuff. I think it became a cudgel and a tool and a lever. Archimedes, give me a lever big enough and I'll move the world. This became, they made this a lever big enough to move the world. And I think there were a lot of other things that happened, along the way that had a political motive and a motif.
Randall, I'm going to end on one word. Sociocide.
Thank you so much. You helped me out there. So I'm going to end. I'm going to end well, that's the thing is, I want it to be the SUI part because it's kind of a self-owned goal. Sociocide,
but patricide, matricide. So it's society. It's a
no, but the society was killed. But we did it ourselves. We did it on purpose. That's the suicide part. Right. I want to get in there. But yes, I like that.
Randall, I got to go to work, man.
All right. So I want to show you this, and people should go buy The Big Fail. This is awesome. And if you want to support my podcast, let's see, where am I? I don't know.
That's Michael Lewis.
You can buy my book. It's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's kind of been overshadowed, like I said. It's an excellent read. How do we know this? Because I said so. And even if you don't read it, you should buy it. Help support the podcast. Thank you so much, Joe Nocera. And maybe I'll catch up with you in Hartford next month.
Oh yeah, great. Yes, that's right. I'll be there. Looking forward to it. But let me talk when we meet next month. Okay?